When I was in garage bands in high school, I always ran into the issue of bass players not being able to keep up with the guitar riffs I was writing. Now, admittedly, I wasn't playing with the best players back then, but it made me take a closer look at how I was writing bass parts when there was a more technical riff happening. In a lot of rock and metal, the bass will double the rhythm guitars. That's a big part of how you get super tight in heavy mixes, but the bass is a bigger instrument with bigger frets and bigger strings, and the more technical a guitar riff is, the more difficult it becomes for the bass to double it exactly. Now, there are plenty of bass players out there who can double pretty much any crazy guitar riff, or if you're programming bass, you don't have to worry about this at all, but that type of player is not the norm, and when you're writing for any instrument, it's important to understand the instrument's strengths, but also its limitations. Not only is it harder to play really fast on the bass, it also doesn't always sound as good as just simplifying the bass part. Where you choose to change a bass part from the guitars and how much you choose to change it is a case-by-case situation. Here's 3 quick tips that help me write for bass more effectively when the guitar parts get really technical. Tip number 1 is simply to have the bass play less notes. If there's a really fast 16th note run in the guitars, for example, the bass can just play 8th notes. This section from my song The Fourth Wall does just that. The guitars and kick play fast 16th notes, and the bass plays 8th notes along with it. Now, the bass could definitely play 16th notes here, but for the sake of clarity and heaviness, I opted for the 8th notes. This riff from my song Unbalanced Tranquility does the same thing. Here the guitars are double picking these descending figures, but the bass is playing each note once. Notice that later in the riff, the bass does play some of these lower 16th note gallops, so you don't always have to slow the bass down, but in some cases it's a good option. Tip number 2 is to have the bass only catch part of a really technical riff or run. In the world of prog, you might find yourself writing some really crazy guitar riffs. In this riff from Broken Epistemology, the bass catches some of the higher notes in the guitar riff, but then it stays down an octave for others. It's still a difficult and notey bass part, but it adds to the power of the riff for the bass to stay lower in places, and it also makes it slightly easier to play, as this string skipping is even harder on bass than it is on guitar. Throughout this crazy instrumental section in the Great Stereopticon, the bass doubles a lot of the faster riffs, but on a few of the quick triplet runs, the bass will play 8th notes underneath. It's not that these triplets would be impossible to play on the bass, but the 8th notes lay a really nice foundation underneath while the rest of the band goes crazy. In this riff that I put together for a riff contest recently, the bass plays some of these really fast sweeping tapping licks, but then in other places it's just pounding out root notes while the guitars do something crazy. It's not an easy bass part by any stretch of the imagination, but having the bass simplify in a few places allows the guitars to shine through. Tip number 3 is to have the bass play something totally separate from the guitars. The bass is its own instrument, and while doubling guitars is important for some riffs, sometimes it's best for the bass to have its own voice. On this tapping part in my song Cosmic Void, the bass plays big root notes at the beginning of each of these ascending runs. This lays a nice low foundation for this very busy riff. The very first riff in the Great Stereopticon has the bass pounding out quarter notes and only catching part of the guitar riff. There's something really primal and intense about the constant quarter notes against the syncopated guitar riff. In this section from my song The Ascent, the bass is playing its own line underneath while the guitars go nuts on top. It's syncing up with the drums and it's providing that bed for the guitars to noodle on top of. So there's a few quick tips for writing bass parts when things get more technical. The bass is such an important part of any rock-based music, and knowing how to write for it effectively can make a major difference in your compositions. Give a few of these ideas a shot for yourself and let me know how they work for you. And if you enjoyed this lesson, subscribe, hit the bell notification, like, comment, share. Till next time, stay proggy.